You and your buddy, who is an African American woman, decide to apply for a new office administrator opening at the local paper supplier office Munder Smithland. You're both equally qualified and have relatively identical resumes, except your friend checks the African American box under race. Several days later, your friend gets a call back for an interview, and not you. Seeing as you're both equally qualified, you both should have had an equal opportunity. However, the playing field was weighed in favor of your friend as soon as she checked the African American box. How does such a phenomenon occur? It occurs through affirmative action.
In order to gauge the public opinion on such a hot topic, we hit the streets to find out how Penn State students feel about affirmative action.
Can you define affirmative action?
I don't think so.
Can you define affirmative action for us?
No, I cannot.
Do you know what affirmative action is?
I'm not entirely sure.
Can you define affirmative action?
Off the top of my head, I honestly cannot.
Affirmative action is a policy or action which favors those who may suffer or have suffered from discrimination when in consideration for employment or education. This usually means that an employer or educational institution will give favor for one candidate simply because they are of a race and or gender that suffers from historical discrimination. Do you know what affirmative action is?
Yes.
Can you define it for me?
Well, it's trying to redress past injustices by having different standards for particular groups.
Can you define affirmative action?
I define affirmative action as specific people of different races and ethnicities having a specific number of people in classes and universities.
Do you know what affirmative action is?
Sort of, kinda.
Can you define it for me?
I guess it's reparations made towards minorities to help better their circumstances in the United States.
Can you define affirmative action?
The assistance of the less fortunate to better their circumstances for the future.
So after explaining affirmative action, most people had a general idea about what it is and know that it exists, even if they don't know what it was called. This is important as it shows that this issue is prevalent within our society.
Now, in order to understand affirmative action, it is useful to consider certain aspects of our nation's history in regards to gender and racial equality. To do so, we'll take a look at the history of both issues.
In the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement was gaining stride for both gender and racial equality. With this came a need for compensation for centuries of discrimination. Affirmative action as we know it today is derived from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act outlawed discrimination based on race, gender, religion, or national origin. Title VII of the Act created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to implement this law. It was then in 1965 that President Lyndon Johnson signed the famous Executive Order 11246, which, quote, prohibits federal contractors from discriminating in employment decisions on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, end quote, and required contractors to, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This was a huge leap and the first real usage of the term affirmative action. President Johnson later went on to justify affirmative action by saying,
"You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights."
President Johnson's advocacy for affirmative action was apparent. However, since its installment in the 1960s, affirmative action has had both progressive support and staunch opposition.
In the 1971 Griggs versus Duke Power Company case, the Supreme Court would rule that the
1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits not only international job discrimination, but also employer practices that have a discriminatory effect on minorities and women.
Several years later, in the 1978 University of California versus Bake Supreme Court decision, affirmative action was upheld, and it was concluded that while it is wrong for a university to have a quota for minority positions, it is okay to take race into account in the college admission policy.
Then in the famous 1980 Fully Love versus Kleknick's case, the Supreme Court contradicted itself and ruled that some modest quotas were constitutional in the hiring process as long as they did not violate the rights of non-minority workers.
Jumping forward to the 1989 City of Richmond versus Croson case, we see that for the first time, affirmative action was judged as a, quote, highly suspect tool. The Supreme Court maintained that affirmative action must be subject to strict scrutiny and is unconstitutional unless racial discrimination can be proven to be, quote, widespread throughout a particular industry.
In 1997, California enacted the very controversial Proposition 209, in which it was decided that, quote, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. Then, in the 2006 Parents versus Seattle and Meredith versus Jefferson, the Supreme Court ruled against the Seattle School Board's program that used individualized racial classifications when assigning students to classes in order to promote diversity in the school. The Supreme Court declared this program to be unconstitutional, stating, public schools may not use race as the sole determining factor for assigning students to schools.
In the Schuett versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action's case of 2014, Michigan's Attorney General Bill Schuett questioned whether Michigan's state constitutional amendment violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The ruling on this case was in favor of Michigan State, as the court upheld Michigan State's constitutional amendment prohibiting state universities from considering race as part of its admission process. Even now, there are decisions being made about affirmative action. The Supreme Court is currently debating the case Fisher versus the University of Texas, where it is being decided whether or not the University of Texas at Austin's admission policy is constitutional. In this policy, 75% of admitted students are admitted because they are in the top 10% of their high school class. The other 25% are admitted because of their race and/or socioeconomic status. Fisher, an applying student, is arguing that this form of admissions is reverse racism and has prevented her from getting accepted to the University of Texas.
We can now see a bit of the history and development of both gender-based and race-based affirmative action in the United States. It is difficult to dispute that affirmative action laws and court decisions, whether race-based or gender-based, have a significant influence on both employment and educational decisions. The controversy herein lies in whether or not affirmative action is in promotion or in violation of equal rights. Is affirmative action rightful moral compensation or unlawful reverse discrimination?
And is affirmative action rightful moral compensation or unlawful reverse discrimination?
I'd have to say it's unlawful reverse discrimination. I think it was Clarence Thomas of the Supreme Court also took that stance in an interview that he did, where he said that he believes all should be treated equally, especially in this process, and that those who are most qualified should take the position in college.
Would you say, in your opinion, is affirmative action rightful moral compensation or unlawful reverse discrimination?
I would say it's rightful compensation because I personally am probably more fortunate than others in less fortunate circumstances, so I can deal with being in a college that's slightly lower ranked than somebody who has a more poor background.
Would you say that affirmative action is rightful moral compensation or unlawful reverse discrimination?
I don't think it's right. I feel like whoever has the most potential or the most experience and is best fit for the job should get the job.
Affirmative action rightful moral compensation or unlawful reverse discrimination in your opinion?
I think it's a good thing to do in certain situations.
In your opinion, rightful moral compensation or unlawful reverse discrimination?
I think it's a lawful reverse discrimination. I think it's just a way to say, oh yeah, we're doing this for minorities and just get away with it, but that's my opinion.
Affirmative action is a public controversy. This much is true. The public's opinion on it ranges from necessary moral compensation to unlawful reverse discrimination. But why is there no consensus? Why is it such a controversy?
Our country teaches two opposing policies. On one hand, we are told to help those that are less socioeconomically privileged because they are not in control of their circumstances. On the other hand, we are told to forget labels and view people based on their ability rather than skin color or gender. Which teaching should be adhered to, and when do we call upon one method and not the other? Do we set a strict standard across the country, or leave it up to a case-by-case basis? This is why affirmative action is such a controversial issue.
Since its creation, affirmative action has been a heavily debated topic in America. Some believe affirmative action is a necessary program to help those who have been historically discriminated against both in the working sector and in the educational system. Others argue that it is simply a form of reverse racism enacted to take away opportunity from those that are better qualified. This controversy stems from our country's double standard of wanting to assist those that are underprivileged, yet pushing a no-label society. So who should have gotten the job at Smithland? You or your friend? The moral conclusion is up to the individual. Our conclusion is that the issue will remain controversial for years to come.